Dr. Mitchell again. We are exploring mathematical expressions some more today, focusing specifically on how to actually use expressions to produce values, as well as expanding our algorithms to use these different expressions and expand the results that we can get. So, what are we learning? We are going to learn how to represent step-by-step algorithmic processes using sequential code segments. So we're focusing on sequencing in this video. We're going to not only focus on how we use sequencing, but we'll look at what expressions can consist of and how we evaluate those. So just to recap, remember that an algorithm is a finite set of instructions that accomplish a specific task. And algorithms are composed of sequencing, selection, and iteration. Here, we're going to be focusing on sequencing, how we have an outline or a set of steps that we're going to do and follow in the order that they're given. So if we're going to do this step and then this step and then this step, we do those in those order. So if I'm using expressions, now expressions can consist of different types of values on the other side of that assignment operator. So we have been using where we stored an actual value inside of a variable. So for example, if I store the value 82 inside of grade, I could also store the value of a variable inside of another variable, which we did before. So in this case, I might have current score as an expression that's stored inside of my high score variable. I could also store the result of an operation inside of a variable. So maybe I might do first name plus last name and store that result inside of a variable called name. Or I could store the result of a procedure call, such as calc average, that's meant to calculate the average of these three numbers given. And I might use that to store, call that procedure to store the result inside of my average variable here. We will talk more about calling procedures in a later topic, our topic 3.12, that you can look at to get more information later on. So ultimately, though, these expressions will produce one single value that's going to get stored inside of these variables. Now, the order of operations and the way that these code segments are executed is also important. So again, remember that with algorithms, sequencing is a core component of that. So I'm going to do these statements in a very specific order. So in this case, I'm going to do grade 1 first and store that value in there. Then I would go to the next line and store the grade 1 value inside of grade 2. On average grade, the line that has average grade, you're going to see that I'm storing the result of an expression where even then I'm going to do the grade 1 plus grade 2, then divide that result by 2 and store it inside of average grade. We'll be looking more at some examples of that later. And then calling the display procedure to show the value that's stored inside of average grade. So these are done in the order that they're given to the program. And then if there's expressions, inside of each of these lines, then those expressions are then evaluated and stored accordingly. So let's look at some examples within an actual program. Let's say, for example, I have this particular code segment and I'm trying to figure out what is displayed after I run this. So since it's an algorithm represented as program code, I am going to follow sequencing and go from one line to the next in order to determine this result. So first, I'm going to store the value 2 inside of my num1 variable. Then on the next line, I'm going to store the value 4 inside of my num2 variable. On the next line, I store the value 6 inside of my num3 variable. On the next line, I'm actually going to evaluate this expression, num2 plus num3, which ends up calculating out to 10, right? Because num2 has 4, num3 has 6. So after I evaluate that expression and get 10, I store the value 10 inside of my num1 variable. Num3 is going to evaluate the expression num1 plus 5, So in this case, num1 currently has the value 10. Then I'm going to do plus 5, so I get 15. So I stored that result inside of my num3 variable. On the next line, I'm going to evaluate the expression num1 plus num3 divided by 5 and store the result of that expression inside of num2. When I do that, I have num1 currently has the value 10. Num3 currently has the value 15. So when I do 10 plus 15, I get 25. And then I divide that by 5. So I get 5, which is then stored inside of my num2 variable. Now I'm going to call my display procedure a few times so I can see what's inside of these values on my actual console window from my program. So when I display num1, I get 10. When I display num2, I get 5. And when I display num3, I get 15. So let's take a quick moment to practice writing out an actual algorithm to perform this task. Let's say I want to calculate and display the average of three numbers, 25, 43, and 18. Pause the video, take a moment to write out the algorithm. You can write this out in either text-based language or block-based. So first things first, of course, I need to store the value 25 inside of num1. Then I need to store the value 43 in num2. Then I need to store the value 18 inside of num3. Then I'm going to calculate that average or calculate the average of those three and store it inside of my average variable. So I would do that by adding those three numbers together, divide them by 3, and store the result of that expression inside of my average variable. And then I display the result. So just to recap what we take away from this, we can represent these step-by-step processes using sequential code segments. We can use sequencing in order to make sure that our code is executed in the correct order, and expressions are used to evaluate either a value, a variable, on operation or a procedure call, and we would store that single value that's produced inside of our variable that we're trying to store it in. So thanks. See you guys in the next video talking some more about mathematical expressions.